Hi, I'm Stephanie Rozzo. Welcome to Nature Sketch Creates Go Out and Sketch a Colorado Blue Columbine instructional video. In this video, I'll be showing you how to apply what you learned in the step-by-step lesson to sketch a columbine. First, make sure you have all the materials you need before you go out to sketch. Remember, this is just a sketch. Have fun, relax, and take your time observing nature. Let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is get a light, rough drawing of this plant onto your paper. You want to determine what parts you want to add, and like with our step-by-step, I'm going to add this flower here and maybe this tiny bud and maybe these leaves. And I'm going to trace this on, and I'll show you what I mean by tracing it on, to my paper. Alternatively, you can just draw some shapes for each part of the flowers, like a line for the stem, and just kind of draw that line, or in a circle with some lines orientating, giving you the orientation of the stamen here. And the pistils are hiding in the middle, so you can't see them in this one. And you can kind of draw some lines out for where these spurs are from each of these petals. And you can also draw lines for all of the different sepals as well. And you just kind of draw lines out from that circle. And that'll allow you to be able to make this bigger or smaller than the actual flower onto your page. So I'm going to just go ahead and trace it, but I'll use some of those shapes as well. So this is kind of nice. I'm going to set this right in here. And I'm just going to draw some really light rough marks for the flower. It's very similar to our step-by-step lesson where we transferred the line drawing. You have to draw in this case, whereas before you're just transferring the lines themselves. So we're getting a light drawing onto the paper that we can paint. And I'm just really kind of outlining really rough shapes, kind of like tracing the different flower parts on there. So super rough. If you can see that, they're very rough, and just a very rough sketch. And then what I'll do is I'll draw these different flower parts onto my page. So I can use shapes now to do that, and I have to determine what part is the best place to start for determining what I need. This central petal is kind of like a landmark for me. So I'm going to draw that in. And let's see. So I have two of the spurs in the back, and the spur in the front, and this spur on the side. So you can see I used a couple lines to draw those in. And there's a petal going this way. And this spur goes up to this petal. And I'm just drawing an oval for this lip here. And then I'll draw just a quick shape connecting the bottom of that spur and the line I already drew, and a tiny little circle at the end. Draw the line right back up. And so then there's the sepal coming out, and I'll just draw a line there and go ahead and just kind of draw it in using shapes to create one continuous shape. So you can see there's a few separate shapes there. And then there is the spur coming down here, and you can see the stem peeking out between these two spurs. So I'm going to just draw that in. I'm not getting super straight lines. These are all really rough, jagged lines. This is just a sketch, so you can keep them rough and jagged or smooth them out later with ink. Whatever works best for you. Just getting a representation of this plant onto the page. And I'm just going to keep going from this area and draw in the different elements using simple shapes and quick little light marks with my pencil. And I'm going to draw in the stamen all as one shape because it's kind of this tube-like shape here. And then later on I'll add in the little details. The anthers and the filaments. But that gives me an idea of where this petal is in relation to that. And I'm going to draw this one line in because it feels like kind of a landmark line. So you just want to make sure you have the lines you need in order to draw this. And if you make a mistake like I did here, where not a huge mistake, just a little one, where I feel that's a little bit more curved and I drew the line too straight, just draw a slightly darker mark to indicate that. So I'm gonna just keep doing this throughout, and you can change where things are. So I did a light line there and I moved it over because it looks a little different from when I traced it. Not a lot, just a tiny bit. You don't need to keep anything the way you start, but don't overthink it too much either because this is just a sketch. And remember, you've already drawn this plant once, so you can do this. And so now that I have the flower drawn, I'm going to go ahead and move down into the stem. And it's not really where that starts. So I'm looking at this in relation to this in relation to this. So it kind of curves up. It gives me an idea of where it's going to be. And even though that's not exact, so I'd figure out where it would be in placement. So that would be about there, and maybe my spurs aren't long enough, which I can change too because they go all the way down here. So I drew some lines for my spurs, but I didn't actually draw them as long as they were supposed to be. So that's fine. I'm going to erase those. And if you make a mistake that's significant to your picture, feel free to erase it. Just don't get too carried away with keeping lines too straight or getting exactly the right size, or having the placement exactly the same. And if the lines are going to confuse you, those would confuse me a bit, go ahead and erase them. But if they're not going to confuse you, they can add nice stylistic look to your painting. So when you have those elements added in that you like them, you can refine them a little bit more. I'm going to add the stem first. And then I'm going to do any additional marks that I need. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in the anthers and filaments. And I'm not going to get exact with the placement. Just kind of think about how they're moving central and the direction and the basic placement. So they kind of start, in my viewpoint, in the center area here. And then they're little ovals. And they kind of go up into a little spike. And then there are a few stray ones here and there. So I'm just going to draw those in, not worrying about amount or placement too much. And I'll draw some lines in, just some rough lines, and I'll indicate those. And then I have my flower. Now I'll just go ahead and add in maybe this little bud, and to kind of show how it's growing really low, I'm just going to go ahead and keep it where it's at. So I'm just going to draw around it, not getting too exact, just getting an idea of its placement and size again. And then I'll just go ahead and draw it on. So first I'll give it the overall shape, so the oval here, and make sure I have that right first before adding the details. And it's going to be either a little bit bigger here after I traced it, because I traced the outside of the bud. And I'm going to draw some lines indicating the spurs and then the stem. And there's a little leaf behind it. And now I'll go ahead and add some of those details in, so refining those spurs and the bud details a little bit. So this, I'm using some slightly darker line marks. Let's see, so that looks like about what I need. So I'm going to go ahead and write in the common name and scientific name. And so now that I have this drawn, I could add in these leaves as well, but I like what I have included here, and I'm going to go ahead and, or I could even add these tiny, tiny little leaves here. And strangely enough, this plant, when I first bought it, was very large, and for some reason it has gotten, the blooms have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. The blooms started out close to the size of my hand, a little bit smaller than that, maybe about like this big, and now they are this small. And even this bud is super tiny, and these leaves have gotten tinier, and these leaves have gotten tinier. So that's something that I could add as an observation on the outside, and I'm curious to learn and find out why this plant has gotten smaller and smaller. Maybe it's the way I've cared for it, maybe it's because this is not its natural environment, maybe it's the soil, maybe it's the amount of sun. I have no idea, but those are all things I could put questions on the outside of this as observations, in addition to or instead of its name, common name, and scientific name. But for simplicity, I'm good, and for consistency, I'm just going to add the common name and scientific name, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to adding some paint. So similar to with our step-by-step, I'm going to start with the yellowish undertone color throughout here. So I'm going to take the I've already pre-mixed my colors from my step-by-step, and I can reuse quite a few of these here, not all of them. So I'll use this pre-mixed yellow color, and I'll go ahead and I revived these with a little bit of water. So I'll take the wettest, lightest yellow, dab it off onto my towel, test it out on my paper, and I like that. I'm going to go ahead and add it throughout the leaves and even through some of this bud and the spurs here. And then I'm going to add it in stamen. I'll go back and add a little bit of a darker yellow because that's a very dark, prominent yellow. And the stem. So I have a stem coming right here. And it doesn't need to be exact, so I'm not staying really in the lines. Just getting that paint in there. Any mistakes make this a unique, fun, sketchy image. It will be unique to you and your mood. And that's another thing you can write in on the edges and here in the white space. You can talk about what your mood was on that day that you were sketching. I'm cleaning off my brush. I'm going to pick up a little bit of this super dark yellow. This should be dry already because I'm dabbing it off on my towel before applying it to my paper. Test it on my paper, make sure it's not too dark, but I like how dark it is. I also need to make sure it can move, so I'm adding just a tiny bit more water so it moves on my paper a little better. That looks good, still dark and moves. I'm just going to go ahead and add it to this entire tip of this stamen spike here, and just to each individual anther. There's a little bit of green in the filaments. And then I'm going to clean off my brush. And this flower is a little tricky because we have this purple color here, and then these sepals are actually like a red purple underneath, and then a purple on top. So it's going to take two colors in order to do that. So let's put the red purple underneath and the purple on top, and I should get a very similar color. And I'll have to do that also to the spurs. And unlike our step-by-step columbine, the color actually ends right here and without a gradient at all. So that'll be very simple to paint. So this is getting a little bit dry. I'm going to add in, since it's dry, I'm going to add the green. I'm going to take the wettest, lightest green, adding a little bit more water, dabbing on my towel and testing it on my paper. Looks good. So I'm going to pick up a little bit more, dab it on my towel, and go ahead and start adding it. I'm going to add it to the bud, just a little bit sparingly. Some edges, not getting real exact, again, being kind of messy with it. Dabbing it off on my towel again, a little bit too much paint. Picking up more, dabbing on my towel, and then adding it here to right underneath. It's a little too dark, so I'm going to dab it off my towel again. Too much paint there. It's okay. And just move it throughout. I'm going to clean off my brush because it's just quite a bit too dark. And then take that damp brush to pick up some of that paint while it's still wet. Add more water to this area on my palette since it's coming out too dark, dabbing on my towel, and I could test it here. Looks a lot better. And I'm just going to move that through the stem and over all the leaves. And I'm just going to try to preserve these areas where it's kind of yellow to stay true to the flower and the plant itself. So I'm trying to avoid the center part and the tips and the edges because they are a little bit yellowish. But this is just a sketch, just a representation, so it does not have to be perfect. Just an observation, so if you don't get it in the right place, it's totally fine. And then while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of this reddish. So I think this reddish color is going to be too dark. It's too deep red for this particular plant, even if I get it really light. this color is just probably going to be too much for this columbine. So what I think it needs is a little bit more blue. So I'm going to take this little bit of blue, not too much, and I'm going to add it to my main color here. Just going to mix it all up. Dab it on my towel and test it out and see if that's a little bit better. It still needs a little bit more blue. Well, that actually looks a lot better. That little bit of blue made a big difference. I think that's about right. So I'm gonna go ahead and use that color. I'm gonna pick up a little bit, put it to the side, adding some water to it. Making it real wet and light, just less concentrated. Testing it on my paper, looks pretty good. I'm gonna add that, it's dry, to my bud in these areas where it's kind of reddish purple. Looks pretty good, pretty close. Again, if you can't get the color exactly right and you don't want to spend too much time trying to figure it out, and why it's good to have your color wheel for helping with these kinds of things. But if you can't get it right and you think it's still a bit off, you can always just note that on the side. Don't feel like you have to spend too much time figuring out the color. So then I'm just going to add a little more water. I'm going to add that over these sepals and just over the entire space. And yes, I know this is not the same color. I'm going to add some of that purple color, violet, over it, and it should give us the right color. And if you like, you can test this idea out on your paper before you actually do it. But I can see that there's two, in my eyes, the way I see this, there's two colors here. Next, I'm going to mix a violet color and add that on top of here. Looks like I smut, oh, that's erasing lines. I'm gonna add the violet color right on top of that. That's already dry because I'm not using too much water. I'll be using the brilliant cadmium red and the ultramarine. And I had these left over from my step-by-step, of course. Make sure they're well mixed. I'm gonna find a little space on my palette. There's a little space back here. 1, 2. And I think it's kind of a reddish purple, so put more red. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I'll mix that up, take a little bit to the side here, add some water to it, dab it off with my towel, add even more water so it's real light and wet, not too concentrated of paint color. Test it on my paper and check it out. Now, I think that looks close enough to me. And I'm just going to take maybe a slightly darker color of that. I've added maybe a little too much water to it. And that needs a little bit more water now. Sometimes this can be a back and forth, just kind of figuring it out. Looks pretty good to me now. I'm gonna take this color and dab it off on my towel, and then I'm gonna paint the petals and the sepals and the spurs as well. So it's just an overall color. A little too dark, just dab it off on your towel. You can keep going. Pick up a little bit more, dab it off. And there I have the darker color. I could even probably put one more layer of that purple over it, but we'll let that dry and maybe add a little bit more. But then it has that vibrant reddish hue to it as well. And while that's drying, I'm gonna add a little bit more of that, purple to the bud, and maybe some more green as well. So I think I'll start with the green. I'm gonna take this not too dry, not too wet color, because these leaves aren't super dark, and add it throughout, dabbing it off on my towel first, and then adding it, and you can test it on your test strip, of course, first. See, that's a similar darkness. So it's the right concentration of color. And I'm just carefully placing that, and I have my hand firmly placed on something to keep it steady. And I'm trying to preserve a little bit of that green-ish yellow color underneath as well. And preserve those edges. So I'm kind of painting just in the center of each of these little lobes that are coming off the main leaf, and trying to preserve some of the vein as well, but it's not necessary. These are pretty dry, so I'm not worried about them blending, the paint blending together. So I'm going to clean off my brush. Next, I'm going to put a little bit of this deeper purple in again. So it's the color. And make sure it's not too dark, so I add a little bit more water. Just test it out on your paper till you get it right. And I'm just going to add it to the darker areas of these sepals to really get them to stand out. And it's adding some grooves and some shadowed areas to give us a little bit more dimension and depth. You can see a cute little spider climbing on here. I'm not sure if you can see that on the camera or not. Very, very tiny little speck. It's another thing I could paint in here or draw in. I could do a little speck and point to it and say, there's a little spider living in this flower. It's important to make this your own sketch and add the observations or whatever you like to add to it, or nothing at all. So this is your sketch, you make it your own and add what you would like to add. And columbines come in so many different colors. Hopefully you're attempting to paint a columbine and figuring out using your color wheel what kind of color. But if you have access to a blue one, it'll definitely be simpler since you already have the color formulas. I also think there's a very, very, very little tiny bit, so very, very faint area in center here is a little too faint, so pick a little more and add it just to the center to give that flower a little bit more depth as well. And then lastly, I'm going to add a little bit of that reddish purple color to the stems and a little bit more to the bud. So I'll pick up a little bit of that, test it on my paper. Make sure it's not too terribly dark. Dab it off on my towel after picking up some more and add it in to the different flower parts I mentioned, the bud here. this in here, and there's a little bit on the tips that I can see some of these leaves. And then I think I like how this paint looks. I think it's all dark enough. So I am going to leave it like this and move on to adding some ink. So adding ink lines, the last step. And I always like to start with the tiniest tip. You don't have to do this, but it helps so that I can just kind of redraw whatever I want. And then I can think up the lines later. If I add a big thick line right now, it might kind of make it a little bit too heavy. I might not like it too much, or maybe it just be something that I couldn't change and adjust. And mistakes are great, but sometimes heavy-handed mistakes can be too much. So I like to start with the little lines to go ahead and redraw this and redefine some areas. And this is the black 005 micron. And right now that little spider's just kind of made a tiny web in this part of the flower. And so that's kind of interesting. And if I was going to write on the side here, it might indicate that. Otherwise it just looks like I have a black dot in the middle of my flower. So I'm not going to do it. Add it in. So you can just go throughout and redraw all these lines. Make sure to write over any of your text you added in. And I like to use this time to kind of make the text look a little bit nicer. I'm using the black 01 micron, slightly thicker tip, to thicken some of the lines in the bud and the flower. And so any of these things that I think are just a little bit thicker, but not super dark, or even the super dark areas, just thicken up some of those lines, adding a little bit more contrast. Lastly, I'm going to use the 08 black micron. This has a very thick tip, to add in some contrasting lines. So where there's some heavy lines and heavy shadow, I really wanted to find some parts of this little bud here. But using it sparingly, some light edges and dark edges to really make this image pop out. And without that, ends up looking a little flat. So even though we didn't add a lot of different colors, we can get this image to pop from the page by using a varied amount of thick and thin lines. So lastly, I'm going to add, just thicken up the common name here. And I don't want to smudge it, so I'm going to take a piece of paper, cover it up, and just write it in. So now I'm done. Great job observing your world, and keep practicing. Thank you for joining me for this sketching session. If you like this video, please click the like button and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Check out the Nature Sketch Crate website for future crates and to sign up for regular updates through our newsletter.